He slammed the envelope against the wall so hard the frame beside it shattered. Inside that envelope was a name he hadn't spoken in 6 years, a name that had cost him everything: his career, his wife, his silence. And now that name had sent a black car to his front door. A woman in a tailored suit stood on his porch, looking at him like she already knew what she'd taken from him. "My father has died," she said quietly, "but I came to pay his debt." He almost shut the door in her face. Almost. Drop your sitsy in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. If it hits you hard, subscribe. You won't want to miss where this goes. The morning it all started again, Daniel Reeves was fixing a leaky pipe under the kitchen sink when his daughter called from the front window. "Dad, there's a car outside." He didn't look up. What kind of car? The kind that doesn't belong here. That made him look up. He wiped his hands on a rag, walked to the window, and pulled back the curtain just enough to see without being seen. Black SUV. New model. The kind with tinted windows so dark you couldn't tell if anyone was inside. It was parked directly in front of his house, not across the street, not a few houses down. Right there. In a neighborhood like Clover Hill, where most people drove pickup trucks with rust on the fenders and bumper stickers peeling at the edges, a car like that didn't park somewhere by accident. "Go upstairs," Daniel said. "Why?" "Just go, Nora. Take your book." His daughter, 8 years old, sharp as a blade, and twice as stubborn, read his face for exactly 1 second before she climbed the stairs without another word. She'd learned that tone. She knew what it meant when his jaw went tight and his voice went flat. Daniel stood very still. The SUV sat there for a long moment. Engine off. No movement. Then the door opened. A woman stepped out. A woman. She was somewhere in her mid-30s, dark hair pulled back, dressed in a coat that probably cost more than Daniel's mortgage payment. She moved with the kind of composure that came from years of being watched, controlled, deliberate, every step placed like it meant something. She looked at the house number. Then she looked at the door. Then she walked straight toward it. Daniel was already at the door before she knocked. He opened it before her knuckles touched the wood. Up close, she was younger than he'd thought. And more tired. There were shadows under her eyes that no amount of money could hide, and something in the line of her mouth, a tension she was holding by sheer will. She looked at him and said without any preamble at all, "My father has died, but I came to pay his debt." The words hit him like a fist to the sternum. He knew that name. Not because she'd said it yet, but because of the way she was standing. Because of the car. Because of the set of her shoulders and the weight behind her eyes. He knew who had sent her before she ever introduced herself. "Who are you?" he asked. His voice came out completely flat. "Vivian Hart." She paused. "My father was Gerald Hart." The name landed in the space between them like something dropped from a great height. Daniel didn't move, didn't flinch. He had trained himself over 6 years not to flinch at that name, not to let it show what it did to him when he heard it. But something must have shifted in his face because Vivian Hart watched him with an expression that looked almost like grief. "I know who you are," she said. "I know what he did to you." "Then you wasted a trip." He started to close the door. Her hand came up, not grabbing it, not pushing against it. Just resting there, fingers spread flat on the wood. "Mr. Reeves, please. I have nothing to say to anyone named Hart." "I do." Her voice was quiet, but it didn't waver. "I have something to say to you. And I've driven 4 hours to say it. I'm asking for 15 minutes. Daniel looked at her hand on his door. He looked at her face. He stepped back. She didn't sit down when he gestured toward the couch. She stood in the middle of his living room like someone who wasn't sure she'd earned the right to sit yet. He stood across from her, arms crossed, keeping the coffee table between them like a boundary line. "You said 15 minutes, he said. "Start talking." "My father died 3 weeks ago," Vivian said. "Heart failure. He'd been sick for about a year." She paused. "I wasn't there when it happened. We hadn't spoken in months. I'm not interested in your family history." You will be. She reached into the bag she carried and withdrew a manila folder. She set it on the coffee table between them and stepped back, as if she wanted him to know she wasn't going to force it on him. After he died, I was given access to his private archives, his vault, documents he'd kept sealed for years. Daniel looked at the folder. He didn't touch it. What's in there? Your original report, Vivian said. The one you submitted 6 years ago to the Structural Oversight Committee of Project Cormorant. The one that disappeared. The air in the room changed. Daniel didn't move. His hands crossed over his chest, tightened just slightly against his own arms. 6 years. 6 years since he'd written that report. 6 years since he'd handed it in and then waited longer, and then watched in disbelief as the deadline passed, the project moved forward, and his report was treated as if it had never existed. That report was lost, he said carefully. System error. That was the official finding. It wasn't lost. Vivian held his gaze. It was suppressed. My father ordered it. Personally. She paused. There are emails in that folder. Internal communications between him and 3 senior project directors. There's also a recorded phone call. Silence. A call in which he specifically says, she stopped and something passed across her face that looked like shame. Not performed shame. Real shame. In which he says that no single engineer's report is going to delay a $60 million contract. That the margins on the underwater support modules were close enough. That if anything failed, it would be during testing, not deployment. She exhaled. He was wrong about the last part. 14 people were injured, Daniel said. His voice was still flat, but it cost him something to say it. 3 of them permanent injuries. I know. And I was blamed for it. Because I was the last one on record to have inspected those modules. They said I missed it. They said I falsified my inspection data. The words came out controlled, measured the way they always did when he made himself say them out loud. Because saying them without control meant they would break him, and he had sworn 6 years ago that he was done being broken. I lost my commission, my clearance. My entire service record was flagged. No federal contractor would touch me. No private maritime firm would touch me. He paused. My wife was sick at the time. We'd just started treatment. When I lost my benefits, we lost access to the specialist she needed. He stopped. Vivian was watching him. She wasn't crying, but she looked like someone who had been living with a very specific kind of guilt for a very long time and had finally put it down in front of the person it belonged to. She died 18 months after I was discharged, Daniel said. Nora was 6. I know, Vivian said again, quietly. I know all of it. Then you know why I'm not interested in reopening this. She picked up the folder and held it toward him again. Daniel, Mr. Reeves. Mr. Reeves, she adjusted. Everything your career cost you, everything your wife went through. It happened because my father chose a deadline over a life, over multiple lives. Her voice was steady, but her hand, the one holding the folder, was not quite steady. I cannot give back what was taken. I know that. But I can prove it was taken. I can go on record. I can give you back your name. My name, Daniel said, is what my daughter calls me. It doesn't need your help. He walked to the door and opened it. Vivian didn't move immediately. She stood there for a moment looking at him with that same exhausted, grief-worn expression. Then she set the folder down on his coffee table and walked to the door. She stopped just in front of him. I'm not asking you to do this for me, she said. I understand if you hate everything my last name stands for. I'm not asking you to forgive anything. She paused. But there are documents in that folder that prove you told the truth, that you did everything right, that you were destroyed by a man who chose money over safety and then pointed at you when it went wrong. She looked at him steadily. You don't have to do anything with them. You can burn them, but you should know they exist. She walked past him and down the front steps. Daniel stood in the doorway and watched her go. She was almost to the SUV when Nora's voice came from the top of the stairs behind him. "Dad?" He didn't turn around. "Go back to your room, Nora." Who was that lady? Nobody. He closed the door. Dud. That night, he sat at the kitchen table for 3 hours. The folder was still on the coffee table. He hadn't touched it. He'd made dinner, helped Nora with her reading homework, listened to her talk about something that had happened at recess with her friend Caitlin, and done all of it on autopilot, responding, nodding, smiling at the right times while the folder sat in the next room like a live wire. After Nora was in bed, he walked into the living room and sat down across from it. He didn't open it. He stared at it. For 6 years, he had built something from nothing. A freelance inspection contract here, a part-time consulting job there. Nothing that used the full scope of what he knew, nothing that came close to the work he'd done before, but enough. Enough for the mortgage. Enough for Nora's school. Enough for the two of them to have a life that was small, but solid, built on ground that wouldn't shift under them. He had stopped being angry a long time ago. He'd made a decision to stop being angry because anger was a thing that burned fuel you needed for living, and he had a daughter to raise and no room for something that expensive. But anger wasn't what he felt now. What he felt now was something older and quieter and much more dangerous. He picked up the folder. He opened it. The first page was his report. 12 pages, single-spaced technical language he had written himself 6 years ago at a desk in a Navy facility that no longer employed him. He recognized every line. He had written it in a single sitting the night after his third inspection of the underwater support modules, when he'd seen enough to be certain, not worried, not concerned, but certain that the failure margins were outside acceptable range and the project had to be stopped. He had been so sure someone would listen. He turned to the next page. It was an email. Internal Heartline Maritime header. Date stamped 5 days after he'd submitted his report. Gerald, it began. The Reeves report has been flagged by 2 of our review directors as potentially damaging if it reaches the Oversight Committee. Recommend we discuss containment options before the Thursday briefing. Containment options. He read the next email. And the next. He read until midnight. By the time he set the folder down, his hands were completely steady. His face was completely calm. He sat in the silence of his living room in a house where his daughter was asleep upstairs, and the world outside was dark and ordinary, and had no idea what was sitting on his coffee table. He picked up his phone. He found the number Vivian Hart had left on the back of her business card, which she'd slipped under the folder without saying a word about it. He typed a message. I read it. He set the phone down. 30 seconds later it buzzed. I know it doesn't change anything, her message read. But I needed you to know. He looked at the folder. He looked at the phone. He looked at the ceiling. He typed back. It changes something. He didn't send it for a long time. Then he did. The folder was still on the table when he finally went to bed. He didn't sleep for a long time. He lay in the dark and listened to the sound of the house, the creak of the walls, the distant sound of a truck on the highway 2 miles away, the soft rhythm of his daughter sleeping down the hall. He didn't fail. He did his duty. He was erased because he told the truth. He had known that for 6 years. But there's a difference between knowing something and having proof of it in your hands at midnight, reading it in someone else's words, written by the very people who took everything from you. Daniel Reeves lay in the dark and felt for the first time in 6 years the particular weight of something he had told himself was gone. He felt the weight of wanting to fight back. He called her back the next morning, not because he'd made a decision. He was clear about that. With himself, he hadn't made any decision. He called because there were things in that folder that raised questions he couldn't stop turning over, and he needed answers before he could decide anything at all. That was what he told himself at 6:15 in the morning, standing at the kitchen counter with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand. She picked up on the second ring. I have questions, he said. I expected you would. Not on the phone. A pause. Where? He thought about it. Not at his house. Nora would be home from school by 3, and whatever this conversation was, It wasn't one he wanted happening within earshot of his daughter. Not somewhere public either. Not yet. "There's a diner on Merchant Street," he said. "Coburn's. You know it. I'll find it. 11 o'clock. He hung up before she could say anything else. She was already there when he arrived, sitting in a corner booth with a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. She'd dressed differently than the day before. Quieter somehow. Dark jacket, no visible jewelry, hair down. She looked less like a CEO and more like someone who hadn't slept much either. Daniel slid into the booth across from her without a greeting. "You said your father kept those documents in a private vault," he said. "For 6 years. Why?" Vivienne wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "I've been asking myself the same question." "That's not an answer. I know." She looked at him steadily. "My best guess, he kept them because he was the kind of man who needed proof of his own power. Having that report buried, sealed under his control, it wasn't just about covering his tracks. It was about knowing he could, knowing he'd won." She paused. "He was careful about everything. He never destroyed evidence. He archived it, all of it. Because someday, somehow, he thought he might need it as leverage." Leverage against who? Anyone. She said it simply, like it wasn't even a complicated answer. He kept files on business partners, on board members, on government contractors. Gerald Hart didn't trust anyone, and he insured himself against everyone. She looked down at her coffee. "I spent the first week after his death just trying to understand the scope of what he'd kept. Your file was one of dozens." Daniel absorbed that. "How many of those dozens," he said, "involved people who got destroyed the same way I did?" She didn't answer immediately. That was an answer in itself. "There are other cases," she said carefully. "I'm still going through everything. But yours..." She stopped. "Yours is the one with the clearest paper trail, the most complete record. And the one where the human cost was..." She stopped again. "Where what happened to your family makes it impossible to just file it away. Is that why you came, because mine was the worst one?" "I came," Vivienne said, "because yours was the one I found first. And because when I read what happened, what really happened, I couldn't unknow it." She met his eyes. "I'm not here to manage you, Mr. Reeves. I'm not here to offer you a settlement and ask you to stay quiet. If that's what I wanted, I have lawyers who could have mailed you a check and a non-disclosure agreement. I drove 4 hours because I wanted to look at you and tell you myself that what was done to you was wrong. That my father did it deliberately, and that I have proof." Daniel looked at her for a long moment. "The phone call," he said. "The recorded one. Who else is on that call?" 3 people. My father, a project director named Sykes, who retired 2 years ago, and a man named Warren Collier." Daniel went very still. "Collier," he said. "You know him. He was my commanding officer's civilian liaison on the project. He was the one who told me my report had been received and was under review." Daniel's jaw tightened. "He was the one who called me into the office the day everything collapsed and told me the structural failure had been traced back to inadequate inspection documentation. Mine. He's currently Chief Operating Officer of Heartline Maritime's North American Division," Vivienne said. The silence between them stretched. "He's still in the company," Daniel said. "Yes. And when you go public with this, he'll know immediately." Vivienne nodded. "Which is why timing matters. And why I'm talking to you before I talk to anyone else. If this goes forward, it has to be done in a way that doesn't give him or anyone else time to get ahead of it." Daniel leaned back. He pressed his palms flat against the table. "I need you to understand something," he said. "I have an 8-year-old daughter. She's the only reason I kept going after everything fell apart. Every choice I've made in the last 6 years has been about making sure her life is stable. Safe." His voice was measured, but there was something underneath it. Not anger, but something harder. "If I do anything that puts a target on us, that stability disappears. And I am not willing to risk her for justice," Vivienne asked quietly. "For anything," he said. "She comes first. Full stop." Vivian didn't push back on that. She just nodded once with a seriousness that told him she'd already thought about it. "I understand," she said. "I'm not asking you to lead this. I'm not asking you to stand in front of cameras tomorrow. What I'm hoping is that you don't disappear, that you stay in the conversation, that when the time comes, you're willing to confirm what that report says." She paused. "You are the only person alive who can speak to what you saw in those modules. Your technical credibility is the spine of all of this. Without your voice, it's a daughter airing her dead father's dirty laundry. With your voice, it's a whistleblower who was right and got buried for it." Daniel looked out the window. A truck rolled past on Merchant Street. 2 people walked by with coffee cups. Ordinary morning. Ordinary world. He thought about the folder on his coffee table. He thought about the email. Containment options. He thought about Karen, about the last 6 months of her life, when she was too sick to get out of bed and too exhausted to be frightened anymore, and the way she'd held his hand and told him it wasn't his fault. "It wasn't your fault, Danny," because she'd always known that he'd done everything right, and the world had simply decided to punish him for it. He thought about Nora asking him just a few weeks ago what his old job had been like. He'd told her he used to make sure ships were safe. She'd thought about it and then said, "That sounds important, Dad." And he'd said, "Yeah, it was." And then he'd changed the subject. "I'm not making any decisions today," he said. "I'm not asking you to. I need to think about this. I need to talk to someone I trust." He paused. "And I need to know that if I decide I can't do this, if I decide the risk is too high, you'll proceed without me, without dragging my name into it until I'm ready." "That's a fair ask," Vivian said. "And I'll agree to it. But I want to be honest with you, the case is much stronger with your voice. And every week we wait is another week Collier and the others have to cover their tracks if anyone inside the company starts talking. How confident are you that no one else in that company knows you've been in the vault?" She hesitated just for half a second, but he caught it. "There's a legal team that handled the estate," she said. 2 people who knew my father's filing system. I've been careful, but I'm not naive enough to believe I'm invisible." Daniel nodded slowly. "Then we don't have as much time as you might think." Ciao. He didn't go home directly after the diner. He drove to the other side of town to a neighborhood with slightly better kept houses and a hardware store on the corner, and parked in front of a gray split level with a basketball hoop in the driveway. He rang the doorbell. The man who opened the door was 52, broad across the shoulders, with a gray beard he'd had since the Navy, and a look on his face that shifted the moment he saw Daniel standing there. "Reeves." His voice dropped. "What happened?" "Nothing yet," Daniel said. "Can I come in?" His name was Clifton Marsh. Former Chief Petty Officer, retired 3 years out of service. He and Daniel had served together for 8 years, not on Project Cormorant, but before it on 2 separate deployments. Cliff was the only person from Daniel's service life who had never stopped calling, who had shown up with groceries in the month after Karen died and not said a single word about it, just put the bags on the counter and stayed for dinner. He was the person Daniel trusted. They sat at the kitchen table with coffee, and Daniel told him everything. The SUV, Vivian Hart, the folder, the emails, the recorded phone call, Collier. Cliff listened without interrupting. When Daniel finished, Cliff was quiet for almost a full minute. "Collier," Cliff said at last. "Yeah. That smug son of a—" Cliff stopped himself. He put both hands flat on the table. "Daniel, do you understand what that folder means? What those emails mean?" "I understand what they could mean." "No." Cliff's voice was serious in a way that cut through. "Not could. That is documented proof that you were set up. That a sitting corporate officer participated in destroying your career and covering up a safety failure that hurt 14 people." He leaned forward. "You have been living for 6 years like a man who got unlucky. Like the system just chewed you up by accident. This wasn't an accident. I know that. Do you? Because you're sitting here talking about risk and timing and protecting Nora, Which I understand I do, but I need you to hear what I'm saying. There are people still walking around in positions of power who did this to you on purpose, who chose it. Collier is one of them, and if this woman has the proof, she does. I read it myself. Cliff sat back. He ran a hand over his beard. Then what is there to think about? He said. My daughter, Daniel said. That's what there is to think about. Nora is 8, Cliff said. She's going to be 18 someday. 28. She's going to want to know who her father was, what he did when it counted. He paused. I know that's not the practical argument. I know you want the practical argument. But you asked me what I thought, and that's what I think. Daniel looked at him. What's the practical argument? He said. Cliff crossed his arms. Practically speaking, if Hart's daughter is serious and if those documents are what she says they are, this is going to come out one way or another. These things always do eventually. The only question is whether you're standing up when it does, or whether you're standing to the side and someone else gets to tell your story. He paused. And I'll tell you something else practically. The kind of people who silenced you once Collier, whoever else is on that call, they're not going to feel safer if they find out those documents exist, and you're not involved. Being on the outside of this doesn't protect you. It just means you have no control. The kitchen was quiet. Daniel turned his coffee cup in his hands. She said she'd move without me if she had to, he said. That she'd try to protect my name until I was ready. And you believe her. I don't know her well enough to believe her, but I believed that she was tired. He paused. And ashamed. You can fake a lot of things. I don't think you can fake that kind of tired. Cliff studied him. What does your gut tell you? Daniel thought about the folder. He thought about the email again, containment options, and how casually it was written. How routine the language was, as if burying a safety report and ending a man's career were just items on a checklist. He thought about the recorded phone call he hadn't yet listened to, because Vivian had told him the content and he hadn't been ready to hear the voice. Gerald Hart's actual voice saying the words. He'd been so sure 6 years ago that the truth would protect him. That doing the right thing was its own kind of armor. He'd been wrong about that, catastrophically, irreversibly wrong. And that wrongness had cost him more than he had words for. But here was the other thing he'd learned in 6 years of rebuilding. From nothing, silence didn't protect you either. Silence just meant the damage was permanent. Silence meant the lie stood. My gut, Daniel said slowly, tells me that I've been carrying something that doesn't belong to me. He looked at Cliff. And I'm getting tired. Cliff nodded. Just once. Quiet and certain. Then maybe, he said, it's time to put it down. Daniel picked Nora up from school at 3:15 like always. She came through the doors with her backpack half open and a drawing in her hand, a picture she'd made in art class. She told him of their house. She'd drawn him standing in the front yard with a wrench because she explained very seriously she'd drawn him at work. He took the drawing and held it for a moment. Is that a good drawing of me? He asked. It's a great drawing of you, she said. I gave you nice hair. He laughed. It came out unexpected and real, and she grinned at the sound of it, the way she always did when she managed to make him laugh genuinely. He folded the drawing carefully and put it in his jacket pocket. On the drive home, she talked about her day. He listened. He answered. He was present, fully present, in a way that took deliberate effort because underneath the conversation, his mind was running a quieter track, measuring, weighing, turning the same question over like a stone in his hand. He thought about Karen again. Not the ending of her life, which was where his mind always tried to go, but the earlier years. The woman she was before everything fell apart. She had been stubborn and funny and completely unbothered by what people thought of her, and she had believed with a clarity that sometimes frustrated him that you did the right thing not because it worked out, but because it was the right thing. She would have read that folder and looked at him and said something like, "Well, what are you waiting for?" And he would have said, "I'm afraid." And she would have said, "I know. Do it anyway." He pulled into the driveway. Nora jumped out before the car had fully stopped, already running for the front door. "Don't leave your backpack in the yard," he called after her. "I won't." She did. He picked it up smiling despite himself and walked to the front door. He stopped on the porch. He took out his phone and opened the message thread with Vivian Hart. He typed, "I need to know your timeline, and I need to know your plan for protecting my daughter if this gets loud." He sent it. Then he went inside, started dinner, and waited. Vivian responded within the hour. "Can you meet tomorrow morning?" "Not the diner. Somewhere more private. I have something else to show you, and I think we need to talk about timeline in person." Daniel read the message twice. Then he typed back, "My place. 9 o'clock. Nora will be at school." He set the phone down and finished making dinner pasta, the simple kind Nora liked with butter and parmesan, and told himself he wasn't going to think about it anymore until tomorrow. That lasted about 40 minutes. He lay awake until well past midnight. She arrived at 8:55. He respected that. He'd known enough people in positions of power who used lateness as a statement, who showed up 10 minutes after the agreed time to signal that their time mattered more than yours. Vivian Hart knocked on his door 5 minutes early and waited. He let her in and poured coffee without asking whether she wanted any. She took it without comment and sat down at the kitchen table. This time she sat. He noticed that. She set a small external hard drive on the table between them. "This is a copy of everything from the vault," she said. "Documents, emails, the audio file. I've also had an attorney one outside my father's legal circle, someone I found independently review the material for authenticity. Her written assessment is on here as well." She paused. She confirmed that the emails are internally consistent with Heartline's archived communications from that period. The metadata hasn't been altered. The audio is original, not edited. Daniel looked at the hard drive. "You made me a copy," he said. "It belongs to you as much as it belongs to anyone." She met his gaze. "More, actually." He picked it up and turned it over in his hand. Small thing, lighter than it should be for what it contained. "You said you had something else to show me," he said. Vivian reached into her bag again and set a single printed page on the table. She slid it toward him. He read it. It was a brief. Legal language dense and formal. But the content was clear enough. It was a summary of a communication dated 11 days ago between Warren Collier and the current chairman of Heartline Maritime's board of directors. The subject line read, "Re-estate documentation potential exposure." Daniel's eyes moved down the page. If Gerald's personal files are accessed by anyone outside the estate's designated legal team, we have a problem. The Cormorant situation was fully resolved 6 years ago per internal review. Any attempt to reopen through outside channels should be treated as a hostile action against the company and managed accordingly. Managed accordingly. He read it again. "How did you get this?" he said. "It was forwarded to me by someone still inside the company," Vivian said. "Someone who was loyal to my father for a long time and is not particularly loyal to Collier." She paused. "I'm not going to name them. I'm not asking you to." Daniel set the page down. His voice was still even, but something had shifted underneath it. "Collier already knows. He knows I've been in the vault. He may not know exactly what I found, but he knows I found something and he's moving." "How fast?" "Fast enough that I came back to you earlier than I planned." She held his gaze. "Daniel, I need to know if you're in. Not halfway, not still deciding. Because if Collier starts building a counter-narrative, if he gets ahead of this with the board, with their legal team, with their media contacts, it becomes infinitely harder to break through." She paused. "Right now we have a window. It won't stay open." The kitchen was quiet, except for the sound of the refrigerator humming and the distant bark of a neighbor's dog outside. Daniel turned the hard drive over in his hand one more time. "If I do this," he said, "Nora doesn't appear anywhere. Her name, her school, her face. Nothing." "Agreed. Without question. And I want final approval on how my statement is framed before anything goes public. I'm not handing my words to a PR team and finding out they've been softened into something I don't recognize." "You write it yourself," Vivian said. I'll have my attorney review it for legal exposure only. Content is entirely yours. And if this goes sideways, if the investigation stalls, if the board buries it again, if the media loses interest, I need to know there's a legal strategy that doesn't depend on public pressure alone. I've already retained a firm in D.C., she said, independent of Heartline's legal network. They've reviewed the documents, and they believe there's a viable federal case obstruction of a safety investigation, falsification of federal contractor records, potentially more depending on what surfaces in discovery. She leaned forward slightly. The public pressure matters, but it's not the spine of this. The spine is the documents. Daniel nodded slowly. And Collier, he said. What happens to him specifically? Something passed across Vivian's face. Not satisfaction, more like the grim resolution of something long overdue. Collier is named in the audio, she said. He's on record agreeing that your report should be suppressed, and I want you to hear this directly, so you know exactly what we're working with, that if the failure happened during testing, rather than deployment, it could be attributed to the last inspector on record. Those are his words, verbatim. The air left Daniel's lungs for just a moment. It wasn't that he hadn't suspected it. He'd suspected it for years, the too convenient timing, the way the blame had landed so precisely and so fast, the way his documentation had been examined under a microscope, while the project's broader failures were quietly absorbed. He'd suspected it, but suspecting something and hearing that it was spoken aloud, planned, decided in a phone call that was different. That sat differently in the body. He planned it, Daniel said. Not a question. He agreed to it. Vivian said carefully. Whether he initiated it or my father did, I can't say definitively from the recording. But he agreed. He didn't object. He helped design it. Daniel set the hard drive down on the table. Okay, he said. Vivian went very still. Okay. I'm in. His voice was quiet and completely certain. Tell me what you need from me and when. What he hadn't expected was how quickly the other side would move. He found out 3 days later on a Tuesday afternoon when he came home from a short consultation job to find a white envelope in his mailbox with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a formal letterhead, not Heartline's letterhead, but a law firm's. A firm he'd never heard of. The letter informed him that Heartline Maritime's legal department had become aware of his recent meetings with Ms. Vivian Hart, and that any disclosure of proprietary internal documents which were the legal property of the Heartline estate and had been obtained without authorization, would constitute a violation of federal trade secret law and could expose him to significant civil and criminal liability. It was signed by a partner named Raymond Gould. Daniel read it twice. Then he called Vivian. She picked up immediately. I know, she said before he could speak. I got one too. They're calling your copies unauthorized. They're calling them stolen, she said, and her voice had an edge he hadn't heard before. Not fear, but anger. Controlled, cold anger. Which is interesting since I am Gerald Hart's daughter and the legal executor of his estate. Can they do this? Their theory is that the vault was sealed under the estate's legal trust and that I don't have unilateral access to its contents without the co-executor's sign-off. The co-executor is the board's general counsel. She paused. It's a legal argument they probably can't win, but they don't need to win it. They just need to slow us down long enough to get their version of events into the public record first. Daniel looked at the letter again. At the clean, formal language. At the words significant civil and criminal liability sitting there in black and white like a warning shot across the bow. They just threatened me with prosecution, he said. A man who was already destroyed by this company once. I know, she said quietly. And they think that's going to make me back off. A pause. Does it? Daniel almost laughed. It came out as something shorter and harder than a laugh. No, he said. It makes me angry, and I'm more useful angry than I am afraid. He called Cliff that evening. They sent him a letter, Cliff said when Daniel was done explaining. Actual physical letter, with a law firm's name on it. Yes. These people are not subtle. No, Daniel said. They're not, which tells me something. What does it tell you? It tells me they're scared. He paced the length of the kitchen phone against his ear. If they weren't scared, they'd ignore it. They'd let Vivian make noise and then quietly discredit her grieving daughter, complicated relationship with her father, emotionally motivated accusations. They have 100 ways to manage that. They're not managing it. They're threatening it. He paused. You only threaten something that can actually hurt you. Cliff was quiet for a moment. Then, you sound different. I feel different. Different how? Daniel stopped pacing. He stood in the middle of his kitchen and thought about how to answer that honestly. 6 years ago, he said, when all of this happened, I was so sure I'd done everything right. I followed every protocol. I filed every form. I reported through proper channels. And I kept thinking the whole time it was falling apart that if I just stayed calm and trusted the process, it would work out. Because I was right. I had the facts. He exhaled. And then it didn't work out. And I spent a long time trying to figure out what I'd done wrong. You didn't do anything wrong, Cliff said. Firm, no softness in it. I know that now. I knew it then too on some level. But knowing and believing are different things. He paused. What's different now is I'm not waiting for the process to protect me. I'm not trusting the system to do the right thing if I just stay quiet and follow the rules. He thought about the letter, about managed accordingly, and containment options and a phone call where men he'd worked alongside decided he was an acceptable casualty. The system didn't fail me by accident, Cliff. It was aimed at me. And if it's going to come at me again, I'm not going to stand still for it. Cliff didn't say anything for a beat. Then he said, Karen would have liked hearing you say that. Daniel swallowed. He didn't answer right away. Yeah, he said. She would have. See you. The next morning, Nora found him at the kitchen table with the hard drive and his laptop, a yellow legal pad covered in notes beside him. You were up early, she said, climbing onto the chair across from him. Couldn't sleep. She looked at the laptop screen, which he angled away from her instinctively. She noticed him doing it and tilted her head. Is it the lady who came? She asked. He looked at her. What lady? The one in the black car. Nora said it matter-of-factly the way 8-year-olds stated things they'd already decided they knew. I saw her from the stairs. She was nice-looking, but she made you go quiet for like 2 days. Daniel put down his pen. I've been quiet. Quieter than regular quiet. She propped her chin in her hand. Are you in trouble? No, he said. He said it without hesitation, because it was true he wasn't in trouble. Other people were in trouble. I'm working on something from a long time ago. From when you were in the Navy. Yes. She thought about that for a moment with the focused seriousness she brought to things she decided mattered. Is it bad? She asked. It was bad, he said carefully. I'm trying to make it less bad. She seemed to accept this. She slid off the chair to get herself cereal, and then she stopped and looked at him over her shoulder. Dad, she said, remember when you told me the story about the boat in the storm? The one where the captain has to decide whether to turn around or keep going? I remember. You said the right captain knows that going back isn't the same as giving up. She held his gaze with the level, clear-eyed certainty of someone who had been listening much more carefully than he'd realized. But you also said the right captain doesn't turn around just because the storm is scary. He turns around when turning around is the right thing. She paused. Which one is this? Daniel looked at his daughter. At her face open and direct, and entirely her mother's in the way that still sometimes stopped him mid-breath. Neither, he said. We're not turning around. We're going into the storm. She nodded like that was the answer she'd expected. Okay, she said. You should eat breakfast then. You can't go into a storm on an empty stomach. He looked at her for a moment longer than was probably obvious. Then he got up and made them both eggs. That afternoon, Daniel sat down and wrote the first draft of his statement. He didn't write it for the public. Not yet. He wrote it for himself first, the raw version, the one with anger in it, the one that said exactly what had been done, and who had done it, and what it had cost. He wrote it in a single sitting longhand on the legal pad, and when he was done, his hand was cramping, and there were 3 pages of dense tight script that said everything he'd kept inside for 6 years. Then he read it back. Then he crossed out the anger. Not because he was ashamed of it, because it was true, and it was earned, and every word of it was justified. But because anger was for him, and this statement was not for him. This statement was for the record, for the file, for the investigators and the journalists and whatever hearing or courtroom or public forum this eventually landed in. Anger in a statement gave people something to focus on other than the facts. And the facts were what mattered. He rewrote it. Cleaner, precise. The language of a man who had spent 20 years in structural systems engineering, factual, sequential, meticulous. He described what he'd found in the modules. He described what he'd filed. He described what had happened after. No editorializing. No emotional appeals. Just the truth in the plainest language he knew how to use. He emailed it to Vivian at 4:30. She called him at 5:15. Daniel. Her voice was different. He couldn't quite name the difference. Is it what you needed? It's more than that. A pause. This reads like someone who has been waiting 6 years to finally tell the truth in his own voice. That's because I have been. I want to give this to the DC attorneys today. Do it. Another pause. Shorter this time. We're moving fast now, she said. Once the attorneys file preliminary motions, we lose control of the timing. Are you ready for that? Daniel looked at the legal pad on the table. At the 3 pages of anger he'd crossed out. At the clean, careful draft he'd written in their place. He thought about Warren Collier sitting in his COO office, reading a letter from a law firm. He'd probably handpicked believing that the same pressure that had worked 6 years ago would work again. He thought about the words managed accordingly, and how casually they'd been written by men who had never once considered that the person they were managing might one day stop cooperating. I've been ready for 6 years, he said. I just didn't have what I needed. And now, he glanced toward the hallway, where he could hear Nora upstairs moving around her room, probably reorganizing her bookshelf for the 4th time that month, a habit she had that he'd never quite understood, but had come to find quietly reassuring. Now I do, he said. The attorneys filed on a Thursday. Daniel found out via a text from Vivian at 7:14 in the morning while he was making Nora's lunch. 2 words. It's done. He read it, set the phone face down on the counter, and finished making the sandwich. Turkey no mustard crusts cut off Nora's specifications non-negotiable since she was 5. He drove her to school. He listened to her talk about a book report she was working on. He told her to have a good day. He watched her run through the front doors of the school without looking back the way she always did, confident that the world behind her would still be there when she turned around. He sat in the parking lot for a few minutes after she disappeared inside. Then he drove home and waited for the world to respond. It didn't take long. By noon, Vivian called him. Collier knows, she said. He's already been in contact with the board. They're convening an emergency session tomorrow morning. What's their play? They'll try to characterize this as an internal estate dispute. Vivian Hart acting unilaterally emotionally against the interests of the company her father built. Her voice was tight but controlled. They have a prepared statement ready. I've already seen a draft. Someone inside leaked it to me an hour ago. It describes me as a, and I'm quoting directly here, grieving family member, whose access to sensitive materials has led to a misinterpretation of complex internal communications. Misinterpretation, Daniel said flatly. That's the word they chose, yes. There's a recorded phone call with your father's voice on it saying they should pin the failure on the last inspector on record. What is there to misinterpret? Nothing, Vivian said. Which is why they need to move before the audio goes public. She paused. Daniel, I think we need to accelerate the press timeline. My attorneys agree. If we wait for the legal process to play out at its own speed, Collier's people flood the zone first, and we're spending the next 6 months fighting their narrative instead of establishing ours." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "How accelerated?" "There's a journalist. Her name is Patricia Okafor. She covers federal contractor accountability for the Tribune. She's been investigating Heartline's safety record on 2 other projects for almost a year. She's good, she's thorough, and she can be trusted to handle this carefully." A beat. "I'd like to bring her in. Today, if possible. With your statement and the documents." "Today?" "I know that's fast." Daniel stood up from the kitchen table and walked to the window. Outside, the street was exactly as it always was. Mrs. Fenwick next door, getting her mail, a delivery truck idling at the corner. The same unremarkable Tuesday afternoon stillness that had defined this neighborhood for the 6 years he'd lived in it. Nothing had changed out there. Everything had changed in here. "Set it up," he said. Why? Patricia Okafor was not what he'd expected. He'd imagined someone polished and aggressive, someone who came in with a recorder and a list of rehearsed questions designed to get you to say something you hadn't planned to say. Instead, she was quiet, methodical, and she listened the way very few people actually listened, not waiting for her turn to speak, but actually taking in what he said before she responded. They met at Vivian's attorney's office in the city, a conference room on the 14th floor with a long table and a view that Daniel ignored. He sat across from Okafor with Vivian to his left, and 2 attorneys at the far end of the table, and he told his story. He told it plainly. He didn't perform it. He described Project Cormorant in technical detail, what the underwater support modules were, what he'd found during his 3rd inspection, what the failure margins indicated, why he'd been certain enough to file an urgent report rather than a standard one. He described filing the report. He described waiting. He described the phone call he'd gotten 11 days later, telling him the project was moving forward and his report had been reviewed and found to be within acceptable parameters. A call he'd known even then was wrong, but had no way to prove. He described the day the partial structural failure happened. He described the day he was called in and told that his inspection documentation showed irregularities, that a review board had found his records inconsistent with the physical evidence, that his commission was being revoked pending investigation. He described knowing in that moment exactly what had happened, and knowing there was nothing he could do about it because the report was gone and the people who'd received it were the same people accusing him. He described Karen. He kept that part short. He said only what was necessary, the timing, the treatment that stopped the outcome. He said it in the same even voice he used for everything else, because that was the only way he could say it at all. Okafor wrote steadily through all of it. She didn't look up with pity when he mentioned Karen, which he was grateful for. She just wrote, and when he finished, she asked 4 precise follow-up questions about the technical specifications of the report, and he answered all of them. Then she set down her pen. "Mr. Reeves," she said, "I've been covering federal contractor accountability for 11 years. I've worked on 6 major investigations. I've spoken to a lot of people who were silenced by institutions that should have protected them." She paused. "I want you to know that what I've read in these documents, and what you've just told me, this is one of the most clearly documented cases of deliberate suppression I have ever seen." Daniel looked at her. And I want to make sure you understand what happens next. Once this publishes, your name is everywhere. There is no version of this where you stay anonymous. You become the story." She held his gaze steadily. "I'm not saying that to frighten you. I'm saying it because you deserve to go into this with your eyes open." "My eyes are open," Daniel said. "Good." She picked up her pen again. "Then let me tell you how I'd like to structure this." They spent 2 hours with Okafor. By the time Daniel walked out of that building, the afternoon light was fading, and his phone had 6 missed calls. 4 from an unknown number, 1 from Cliff, and 1 from a number he didn't recognize, but which Vivian, walking beside him, identified immediately. "That's Raymond Gould," she said. "Collier's attorney. He called me directly. They're escalating." She looked at her own phone. I have 8 missed calls from the same number. Don't call it back. I wasn't going to. Daniel stopped on the sidewalk. He called Cliff back first. Cliff picked up immediately. I've been watching the news feeds, he said without preamble. Heartline put out a statement an hour ago. I know. Vivian told me. There's more than that. Cliff's voice was careful in a way that put Daniel on alert. Someone posted something on a federal contractor forum, one of those semi-private boards that Navy and DoD people follow. Anonymous post but detailed. It says a disgruntled former Navy officer with a history of filing grievances is attempting to extort Heartline Maritime using stolen private documents. Daniel went still. Extort. That's the word they used. They're calling me a blackmailer. Anonymous post. Can't be traced directly to Collier or the company, but the timing, it's not a coincidence. Daniel started walking again faster. Vivian kept pace beside him, watching his face. They're not just defending themselves, they're going on offense. Daniel. Cliff's voice dropped. I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me straight. Ask. Is Nora secure right now? Where is she? The question landed like a hand on his chest, stopping him mid-stride. He hadn't thought he'd been in that conference room for 2 hours, and he hadn't. He looked at his watch. 3:58. School had let out at 3:15. She's at the after-school program, he said, and even as he said it, he was already moving faster hand going to his pocket for his keys. Until 5. Call the school, Cliff said. Right now. Make sure she's there and tell them nobody picks her up today except you. Nobody. No exceptions. Cliff, I'm not trying to scare you. I'm being careful. These people just put a story out there calling you an extortionist. They are not operating in good faith, and we don't know how far they're willing to go. Call the school. Daniel was already dialing. The school secretary confirmed Nora was in the after-school room working on a puzzle with 2 other kids. He asked to have someone stay close to her until he arrived. He kept his voice normal. He said it was just a precaution. He hung up and stood on the sidewalk, breathing in the cold air and feeling his heartbeat settle by degrees. Vivian was watching him. She hadn't said a word during the call. She's fine, he said. I know. Her voice was quiet. I'm sorry. I should have thought about the timing. I should have made sure she was accounted for before we went into that meeting. It's not your responsibility. It became my responsibility the moment I knocked on your door. She met his eyes directly, without deflecting. I told you I would think about her safety. I meant that. It won't happen again. He held her gaze for a moment. There was nothing performative in what she'd just said. No spin, no careful management of his reaction. Just a straight acknowledgement of a failure and a commitment to do better. Okay, he said. He went to get his daughter. Nora was at a table with 2 other kids and a 500-piece puzzle of the solar system when he walked in. She looked up, saw his face, and immediately began putting away her pieces. We're leaving early, she asked. Yeah, come on, Bug. She said goodbye to her friends, gathered her things with the unhurried efficiency she'd developed from years of reading his moods, and took his hand when he offered it, which she usually didn't anymore, having recently decided she was too old for that in public. He held on to it a little longer than usual. In the car, she didn't ask questions. She sat in the back seat and looked out the window, and after a few minutes, she said quietly, Is it getting louder? What? The storm, she said. The one you said you were going into. He glanced at her in the rearview mirror. Her face was calm. Not frightened, just watching him with that clear, steady attention she'd had since she was old enough to have it. Yeah, he said honestly. It's getting louder. She absorbed this. Are we okay? We're okay, he said. And he meant it not as reassurance but as fact. They were okay. They were intact. And he intended to keep them that way. Okay, Nora said. She went back to looking out the window. Cliff came over that evening. He arrived with takeout containers and a look on his face that said he'd been thinking hard all day, and had come to conclusions he wasn't sure Daniel was going to like. They sat at the kitchen table after Nora was in bed, the food mostly pushed aside, and Cliff laid it out. "They're going to keep escalating," Cliff said. "Every day between now and when that article publishes is a day they use to build their counter-narrative. The extortion story on that forum is just the opening move. Next comes media outreach. They'll have someone friendly at a business publication run a piece about the legal dispute. Frame it as a corporate estate battle with your name in it as the outside agitator." He paused. "And the day before the article drops, if they're smart, they file a civil suit against you. Injunction attempt. They probably can't get it granted, but it creates noise. It gives every news outlet covering the story a reason to add the phrase lawsuit pending after your name." Daniel listened to all of this without interrupting. "They're very good at this," he said when Cliff finished. "They've done it before," Cliff said. "That's what 6 years of watching you rebuild from nothing tells me. This is not the first time they've done this to someone." Daniel nodded. "Vivian said there are other cases in the vault. Other people like you?" "Possibly." Cliff was quiet for a moment. Then he leaned forward, elbows on the table. "Here's what I think you do. I think you call Okafor tonight and you tell her you want the story to run as fast as she can responsibly get it out. Don't give them another week of runway." He paused. "And I think you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that it gets ugly before it gets better. That there are going to be days when you turn on the news and hear your name attached to things that aren't true. And you're going to have to stand still and let the truth catch up." Daniel looked at the table, at the half-eaten takeout containers, and the rings left by coffee cups, and the yellow legal pad still sitting to the side with his handwritten notes from 3 days ago. "I've done that before," he said. "Stood still and let things be said about me that weren't true. I know. The difference this time is you're not waiting for someone else to fix it." Cliff met his eyes. "This time the truth is already in motion. You just have to hold on." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached for his phone and called Patricia Okafor. She picked up on the third ring. He could hear the background noise of a newsroom still operating late. "Okafor? It's Daniel Reeves. I know it's late. I'm still at my desk. What do you need?" "I need to know your earliest possible publish date," he said. "And I need to know if there's anything else you need from me to get there." A pause. He heard the sound of papers moving. "I can have this ready in 4 days," she said. "If my editor clears the legal review by end of week, we could be looking at Sunday publication. Front page digital print. Monday." "Do it," he said. Another pause. "You understand once I file this, I can't unpublish it. Whatever comes after, I understand." "Okay," Okafor said. Her voice shifted slightly, still professional, but something underneath it that recognized the weight of the moment. "Then I'll call my editor tonight." Daniel hung up. Cliff was watching him from across the table. 4 days, Daniel said. Cliff nodded slowly. "How do you feel?" Daniel thought about that honestly. He turned the phone over in his hand. He thought about the 6 years, all of it, the whole long accumulation of it, the silence, and the rebuilding and the quiet grinding work of putting a life back together from pieces. He thought about what Okafor had said in the conference room. "Your name is everywhere. You become the story." He thought about Karen saying it wasn't your fault, Danny. He thought about Nora, 8 years old, holding his hand in a school parking lot because she could tell the way she always could when he needed it. "I feel like myself," he said. "For the first time in a long time, I feel exactly like myself." Cliff held his gaze. "Good," he said. "Hold on to that." 4 days later at 6 in the morning, Daniel's phone lit up with a text from Okafor. "It's live." He sat at the kitchen table in the quiet of the house, Nora still asleep upstairs, and opened the link. The headline read, "Suppressed, Blamed, and Silenced. How Heartline Maritime Buried a Navy Engineer's Warning and Destroyed His Life to Cover It Up." He read his own name in the first paragraph. He read his words, his statement in his voice exactly as he'd written them. He read the technical details of his report, cited back to him with precision. He read Gerald Hart's name and Warren Collier's name, and the words from the recorded phone call quoted in full. He read all of it. Then he set the phone down on the table and sat in the silence of his kitchen while the story moved out into the world at the speed of the internet, unstoppable, irreversible, finally free. He heard Nora's feet on the stairs. She appeared in the doorway in her pajamas, hair pushed flat on one side from sleeping, blinking at the kitchen light. "You're up early," she said. "Yeah." He looked at her. "Want some breakfast? Is the storm over?" He thought about what Cliff had said. It gets ugly before it gets better. He thought about the calls that would start coming in the next hour. The lawyers, the journalists, the people from his past who'd gone quiet and would now have opinions. Everything that was coming. "No," he said honestly. "But we're through the worst of it." She padded over in her sock feet and climbed into the chair across from him, the same chair she always sat in, and looked at him with those clear, steady eyes. "Okay," she said. "Scrambled eggs then. You need protein for storms." He got up and made them breakfast. The call started at 7:43 in the morning. The first one was from a number he didn't recognize, a reporter from a national outlet who'd seen Okafor's piece and wanted a comment. Daniel let it go to voicemail. The second was from a former Navy colleague he hadn't spoken to in 4 years, a man named Torres, who'd served 2 deployments with him and gone quiet after the discharge, the way most people had. Daniel let that one go too. The third was Vivian. He picked up. "It's already being shared," she said. Her voice was different than he'd ever heard it, not calmer exactly, but lighter, like something had been set down. "Okafor's piece. It's been picked up by 3 national outlets in the last hour. There are federal contractor accountability groups sharing it. 2 former Navy officers posted it publicly with their names attached." A pause. "It's moving, Daniel. I know." He was standing at the kitchen window watching Nora eat her scrambled eggs at the table behind him. "What about Collier?" His attorney issued a statement 40 minutes ago calling the piece irresponsible and defamatory. Standard language. Denied everything. Her voice was steady. "But I heard from someone inside the company 20 minutes after that. 3 board members have already asked for an emergency session, not to defend the company, to discuss Collier's position." Daniel absorbed that. "They're distancing from him." "When a ship starts going down," Vivian said, "the rats don't stay loyal." He almost smiled. "What about you? How are you holding up?" A longer pause than he expected. "I woke up this morning, and the first thing I felt was relief," she said. "And then I felt guilty for feeling relieved because my father is still dead and what he did is still what it is." Her voice was quiet. "And then I thought, no, the relief is appropriate, because the truth is out. And the truth being out is the right thing. Whatever I feel about my father, whatever he was to me privately, what he did to you was wrong. What he did to those 14 people was wrong. And the truth being in the world now doesn't undo that, but it means it doesn't stay buried. It means it counts." She paused. "So I'm letting myself feel the relief." "Good," Daniel said. "You earned it." By noon, the story had outgrown anything Daniel had imagined when he'd made the decision to go forward. He sat at his kitchen table with his laptop open and watched it happen in real time. Shares. Responses picked up by television news. A congressman from the Armed Services Committee posting the article with a comment about federal contractor oversight reform. He watched his own name travel across the internet, attached to words he'd written in his own hand, words he'd spent 6 years keeping locked inside because there'd been nowhere safe to put them. It was strange. That was the most honest word for it, strange. Not triumphant. Not cathartic in the clean way he'd imagined it might feel. More like standing in a room where all the furniture had been rearranged while he slept. Everything was in a different place, and he kept reaching for things that weren't where he expected them to be. His phone didn't stop. At 1 o'clock, Okafor called. "I need to ask you something," she said. "And I want your honest answer, not the careful one." "Ask." There's going to be a press conference. Vivian is willing to hold one tomorrow morning if you're ready. Attorneys documents the audio. Full public disclosure. She paused. She wants you there, standing with her. Daniel didn't answer immediately. Why does it matter if I'm there? He said. The story is already out. Because Collier's people are going to spend the next 24 hours trying to make this about a corporate family dispute. About Vivian settling personal scores with her dead father's legacy. Her voice was direct, no softening. If you stand at that press conference, a former Navy officer, a man who was actually harmed, who has nothing to gain from this except the truth, it's not a family dispute anymore. It's a survivor, and that matters. Daniel looked at the table. At Nora's bowl from breakfast still sitting there because she'd run upstairs to get her backpack, and neither of them had put it in the sink yet. I told myself when this started that I wasn't going to stand in front of cameras, he said. I know. I told myself I'd let the documents do the work. The documents are doing the work, Okafor said. But there are 14 people who were hurt in that structural failure, and most of them still don't know what really happened. There are Navy officers who watched your career collapse and believed the official story because there was nothing else to believe. There are people right now reading this article and deciding whether it's true based partly on whether the man it's about is willing to show his face. A beat. I'm not pressuring you. I'm telling you what I know from 11 years of doing this. The line was quiet. What time? Daniel said. He called Cliff. Press conference tomorrow, he said when Cliff picked up. I know. I saw it coming. No hesitation. No, are you sure? Just, you need a ride. I need someone to stay with Nora tomorrow morning, during the conference, someone she trusts. I'll be there at 7:30, Cliff said. And Daniel, for what it's worth, I think you're making the right call. I know you do. I've thought you were making the right call since the moment that folder showed up on your coffee table. I just wanted to wait until you figured it out yourself. Daniel shook his head. You couldn't have led with that. Where's the fun in that? Cliff said. And for the first time in what felt like weeks, Daniel laughed, a real one, unguarded, the kind that surprised him. That evening, after dinner, after Nora's homework was done, and she was settled on the couch with her book, Daniel sat down beside her. She looked up at him over the top of the pages. I need to tell you something, he said. She put the book down. Just like that, no protest, no just one more page. She put it down and gave him her full attention. And he was struck again, as he was regularly struck by how much of her mother lived in that particular quality of stillness. Tomorrow morning, he said. I'm going to a press conference. Do you know what that is? When people talk to reporters, she said. On TV sometimes. Right. I'm going to talk about something that happened a long time ago, when I was in the Navy. He kept his voice even, kept his eyes on hers. There are going to be people who don't like what I say. And for a while, things might be a little loud. People might say things about me that aren't true. And you might hear things at school or see things online that are confusing. Nora listened to all of this carefully. But what you say will be true, she asked. Yes, he said. Every word. She thought about it for a moment. And it's about why you had to stop being in the Navy. He'd never told her the full story. She was 8, he'd told her a version that was true in outline, without being true in detail. That there had been a problem at work. That some people had made wrong choices and he'd been caught in the middle of it. That it hadn't been his fault, but that it had cost him his job. Yes, he said, it's about that. And now people are going to know. Now people are going to know. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said in a voice that was entirely matter-of-fact, with no drama in it at all. Good. They should have known a long time ago. He looked at her. Yeah, he said. They should have. She picked up her book again. Then she stopped and looked at him sideways. Dad, are you nervous? A little? You don't have to be, she said. You're just going to tell the truth. That's the easy part. He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him without looking up from her book, and he sat there for a while in the quiet of the living room thinking about what she'd said. That's the easy part. 8 years old, and she'd already figured out the thing it had taken him 6 years to come back to. The truth wasn't the hard part. It never had been. The hard part was trusting that the truth was worth the cost of saying it. He'd lost that trust once. He was taking it back. The press conference was held at 9 in the morning in a midtown conference facility. Not a Heartline location, not anywhere with the company's name on it. Vivian had been deliberate about that. Neutral ground. The attorneys flanked her at the podium. Daniel stood to her right. He'd worn his good jacket. Nora had told him very seriously that he should wear the blue one because it made him look like someone people should believe. He'd worn the blue one. The room was full, more full than he'd expected. Journalists' cameras, a row of people in the back he recognized from the Navy's Public Affairs Office. 2 individuals from a federal oversight watchdog organization that Okafor had told him had been following Heartline's record for years. Somewhere in the back row, he could feel the presence of people who had been hurt by Project Cormorant. Some of them, Vivian had told him, had reached out after the article published. 3 of the 14, looking for answers they'd never gotten. Vivian spoke first. She was composed and she was clear, and she did not perform grief or apology or redemption. She presented the facts. She described finding the vault. She described the documents. She described her decision to come forward not as the resolution of a family conflict, but as an obligation to people who had been harmed by deliberate choices made inside a company she bore a name connected to. She said her father had been wrong. She said it plainly without drama, and the room was very quiet when she said it. Then she stepped back. Daniel stepped to the podium. He'd written a statement. He had it in his jacket pocket, 3 pages clear and precise. But standing at the podium, looking out at the room, he reached for it and then stopped. He folded his hands on the edge of the podium. He looked at the cameras and the reporters and the people in the back row who had been hurt and were sitting there looking at him with expressions he recognized the particular exhaustion of someone who had been waiting a very long time for someone to say something true. He didn't use the statement. He spoke from memory. From the 6 years of knowing exactly what had happened and not being allowed to say so. He said, "My name is Daniel Reeves. I served in the United States Navy for 20 years as a structural systems specialist. 6 years ago, I filed a safety report on a classified naval infrastructure project. That report was suppressed. The structural failure I warned about happened. 14 people were hurt, and I was blamed for it." He paused. "I was not careless. I was not negligent. I did not falsify my documentation. I did my job exactly as I had been trained to do it, and I filed a report that told the truth about what I found. And the people who received that report made a deliberate choice, not an error, not an oversight, a deliberate documented recorded choice to bury it, to protect a deadline and a contract. And when the failure came, they needed someone to point at. They pointed at me." The room was completely silent. "I lost my career. I lost my clearance. I lost 6 years of work I can't get back. I lost the insurance that was keeping my wife in treatment." His voice didn't break. He had decided it wouldn't, and it didn't. But it was not easy. "She died 18 months after I was discharged. My daughter was 6 years old." He paused again. He let that sit. "I am not here for sympathy. I'm here because the truth has been in a vault for 6 years, and it belongs in this room. It belongs in the public record. It belongs to the 14 people who were injured and never got a straight answer about why. And it belongs to every person working in safety compliance right now who is afraid of what happens if they tell the truth about what they find." He looked directly at the cameras. "What happens is that the systems you're trying to protect will use their power to protect themselves. I know that now. But here is what I also know. The truth is harder to kill than they think. They can bury it. They can lock it in a vault. They can take 6 years of a man's life away from him and leave him with nothing but the certainty that he was right." He took a breath. "They cannot make it not true." He stepped back from the podium. The room stayed quiet for one more moment, that particular silence that happens when something real has just been said in a space full of people who spend most of their lives managing the distance between what's true and what's stated. Then, the questions started. Collier resigned from Heartline Maritime 7 days later. The board released a statement calling it a mutual decision. No one believed that, but no one said so publicly because the federal investigation that had been opened 2 days after the press conference made the distinction between resignation and termination largely irrelevant. The attorneys filed criminal referrals against 3 executives. The civil case on behalf of the 14 injured workers filed by a firm that had reached out to Okafor the morning after the press conference moved faster than anyone expected. The Navy's records office sent Daniel a formal letter on a Thursday. Official letterhead, precise language, all the cold formality of institutional correction. It stated that following a review of the circumstances surrounding his discharge from service, the classification of his separation had been revised. His record was restored. His commendation history reinstated. His final assessment previously flagged cleared. He read it at the kitchen table. He read it twice. Then he folded it carefully and set it on top of the hard drive which he'd kept on the kitchen table since the day Vivian had given it to him, and he sat there for a while without moving. Cliff called that evening. He'd somehow already heard. "How does it feel?" he asked. "Like holding something that should have been mine 6 years ago," Daniel said. "Which I suppose it should have been." "Yeah," Cliff said. "It should have." A pause. "But it's yours now." "It's mine now," Daniel agreed. Vivian resigned from Heartline Maritime the week the board formally announced the federal investigation. She'd told him she was going to do it, told him weeks before calmly, and with complete certainty, the way she seemed to do most things she'd already decided. "I can't rebuild something from inside that I helped expose," she'd told him over coffee in his kitchen the 3rd or 4th time she'd been there by then. "There's no version of that where I'm not part of the problem." "What will you do?" he'd asked. "I have an idea," she said. "Something smaller. A foundation focused on infrastructure safety transparency. Funding independent audits supporting whistleblowers through the legal process, building the kind of reporting structure that should have caught this 6 years ago." She'd looked at him steadily. "I was thinking I might know someone with 20 years of structural systems experience who might want to be involved." He'd looked at her for a long moment. "As what?" he said. "As whatever you want to be," she said. "Advisor. Director of Technical Review. The person who reads the reports before anyone can make them disappear." Her voice was direct, but there was something in it, not plea, but sincerity. "You spent 6 years rebuilding from scratch because someone decided your expertise was inconvenient. I'd like to give it somewhere to go." He hadn't said yes immediately. He'd thought about it for a week, genuinely thought about it, weighed it, talked to Cliff, sat with it at night when the house was quiet, and he was finally, for the first time in years, able to sit with a decision without the weight of everything unresolved pressing down on him. Then he'd called her back and said yes. 6 months after the press conference on a Saturday in early spring, Daniel stood in the parking lot of a newly completed community center in a neighborhood 2 miles from Clover Hill. It had been built by a nonprofit that had received part of a settlement money that had come indirectly from Heartline Maritime's agreement with the oversight investigators. The building had been named for the engineering and safety standards code that Project Cormorant had violated. Nobody outside the field would understand the reference. Everybody inside it would. Nora stood beside him, her hand in his, looking up at the building. Vivian stood on his other side. She had her hands in her pockets and was looking at the building with an expression that was quiet and steady and contained something Daniel had come to recognize over the months of working alongside her, the particular look of someone who had done something that couldn't be undone in the best possible sense. Nora said, "Is the debt paid now?" It was the kind of question only a child asked, direct without irony, looking for a real answer. She'd known in the general terms he'd explained to her over the months what all of this had been about. The debt Vivian had come to his door to pay. The cost that had been owed. Daniel looked at the building. He thought about the letter from the Navy on his kitchen table. He thought about the 14 people who had testified in the civil case, 3 of whom he'd met quietly after the press conference, in a small conference room, where no cameras were allowed. where what happened was not the formal exchange of a legal proceeding, but something older and simpler. People who had needed to know why, who had lived for 6 years with the weight of an accident that had never been adequately explained. He'd been able to tell them why. He'd been able to look at them and say, "Here is what happened. It was not random. It was not an acceptable risk that materialized. It was a choice someone made, and it was wrong, and now the record says so." He thought about Karen. He thought about her with a softness now that had taken a long time to find the grief still there, present and real, but no longer sharp in the way it had been when it was tangled up with all the unfinished wrongness of everything that had followed her death. The wrongness had been addressed, not undone. Nothing could undo it, but addressed. Not fully, he said to Nora. He said it honestly, the way he'd always tried to be honest with her, because she deserved that. Some things you can't pay back. You can only account for them. Nora thought about this. So what happens now? He looked at the building. He looked at Vivian, who was watching him with the same quiet steadiness she'd had the first day she'd stood in his living room and refused to be sent away. He looked down at his daughter. "Now," he said, "we make sure it doesn't happen to someone else." Nora considered this with the seriousness she brought to things that mattered. "That seems right," she said. She let go of his hand and walked forward toward the building, toward the open front doors, where people were gathering, where there was work to be done, and a story that didn't end here, but found its footing solid, recovered, aimed forward. Daniel watched her go. Then he straightened his jacket and walked in after her. He had told the truth. It had cost him everything once, and it had cost him something again, the years of quiet, the smallness of the life he'd built as armor against any further loss. But the truth had also done what the truth does. When it finally gets free, it had moved. It had found the people it belonged to. It had broken the thing it was supposed to break and held up the thing it was supposed to hold up. And Daniel Reeves, former Navy officer, structural systems specialist, single father, the man who had written a report no one was supposed to find, walked through those doors with his name restored. His record cleared his daughter ahead of him and his hands for the first time in 6 years, completely empty of everything that had never been his to carry.